Hello and welcome to the third installment of Readings and Conversations with prize-winning writers from the Missouri Review. My name is Marc McKee, and I'm the managing editor for the Missouri Review. This project is supported by a generous grant from the Missouri Humanities Council through the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I want to be sure to express gratitude on behalf of the magazine and Missourians in general for that generosity. This is the final of 3 readings and conversations, which offer access to contemporary writers and their ideas about their work, their insights into their given genres, as well as prompts for writers and educators alike. I'm happy to be here today with Heidi Seaborn, the winner of the 2022 Jeffrey E. Smith's Editor's Prize for Poetry, and happy to be joined by our poetry editor, Jacob Griffin Hall. Heidi Seaborn is executive editor of the Adroit Journal and the author of Maryland, Essays and Poems, Pank Poetry Prize winner, and Insomniac Slumber Party with Marilyn Monroe, the acclaimed debut Give a Girl Chaos, and the Comstock Chapbook Award-winning Bite Marks. Recent work appears in Blackbird, Beloit, Brevity, Copper Nickel, Cortland Review, Diode, Financial Times of London, Missouri Review, Penn Review, and elsewhere. Heidi holds an MFA from NYU, and you can learn more about her on her website, HeidiSeabornPoet.com. In the foreword to the issue featuring the Editor's Prize winners, TMR's editor-in-chief, Spear Morgan, says of Seaborn's work that it animates art and life with dynamic language, cunning imagery, and the admiration for the minutiae that carry in them the wider world. With a metaphysical complexity and keen attention to description, Seaborn meditates on the past and the future and how their meetings define the present. The poet follows the details of the world around her into the material imagination of the poem. I would only add that one of the most stunning features of these poems are the clear presence of a keen sensibility, and yet each poem is its own singular experience, with a wonderful range of formal gestures and inspired visions. We get world after world from this sensibility. And now, let's get them. Without further ado, Heidi Seaborn.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jacob, and thank you to the Missouri Review. I'm so honored by the prize and to be here with you. So let's hear from the poems. I'll read the first one, House Hunting. I've taken to driving past places where I used to live, peering at the landscape, the facade of this one or that one, as if I'm at a high school reunion, smiling in conversation until the once friend's face softens into the familiar. I wonder if the lilac trees still syrup the air every spring, and if big maple leaves pile like pancakes in the fall. If the agapanthus blue heads forever nod in the pool's reflection. If the swing still hangs from the avocado tree. If the punched wall was ever patched. If the near famous neighbor still lives next door, or did I read he died? If the roots have choked the sewer line, if the ghost has returned, the wasps, carpenter ants, rats, raccoons. If children sleep where mine once did, hair sleek with sweat, cheeks pinked, if behind the now red door, someone also found love, late and grizzled. I wonder if every time I left a house, I left a letter to say, here in this room, a baby arrived home. I mourned my father looking out the bedroom window. I worried, sitting here and there, and yes, there too. The marriage failed in the house, but love surfaced on the front steps. I have loitered, the car engine panting, beside my first apartment with its vast ash tree knuckling the sidewalk. The home I fled to up in the hills. The rental on the edge of the raging Pacific, all that happened there. Wondering who I was when I was alive inside and what remains are markings and notches like bruises covered in layers of paint. This poem is Perhaps This Is a Prayer. When my eye holds the iridescent wing of kingfisher for the split second it soars over the river Avon, I feel the presence of a god, one that sprays the reeds with butterflies, feeds wheat seeds to the most common sparrow. When my friend bends to tame the wildness of flower beds brimming with dahlias and mutters about the mole, I say, that is the God I'm talking about, the one who invites us to tunnel into this luscious earth. Over lunch harvested from the garden, we debate the existence of heaven and hell, knowing only the temporal, how the river twists its body into a lover's embrace of land, and longing silvers the willow's heaving boughs. Each bird alights toward the celestial on the same wings we bestow angels. So when I imagine there is a God, it's because from this morning's open window, I inhaled honeysuckle and jasmine, heard God in the syncopation of birdsong. Faith found this follower at my most tedious self, cornered in a cul-de-sac, the summer's heat beating like an old heart. Me, kneed by the burden of body, a body now tilting into a breeze gathering upward. Bastille Day in Paris, 2022, with an epigraph from Wendell Berry that reads, "The window grows fragile in a time of war." It is summer, and the days long to stretch their tan legs, for all the worlds come to Paris as fireworks flare in the window of night out my hotel. Beyond the Seine, there is war, or they itch for it, but it is summer and the riverbanks become a beach. 80s music plays, the Aperol spritz, neons, every cafe table. A pleasant human hum drums along street shoulders. 1,000 nights I've spent window cracked, the city's smoky voice. A whiff of Edith Piaf. My grandfather had seen her perform in a cabaret between the wars. Paris, restless and fragile. At the Pompidou, the new Saclay-Quitte exhibit of German art from the 1920s. I turn away from rooms of brutal portraits of the frenzied vacuum between wars. Turn my eye to the windowless garrets across Beaubourg. Oh, our minds, what monsters. Once the sands hauled away from the Seine and the music sputters. This poem is called Blue Notes, and it was inspired by Spence Finch's trying to remember the color of sky on that September morning, which consumes an entire vast wall at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. 1. Remember the airmail letter holding the linen sky in its folds. Remember a trace of royal ink on his hand. Remember the mirror held only half of her. Remember her silk blouse like a calla lily, exposing throat and clavicle. Remember she dabbed Chanel No. 5. Remember the harbor shimmering electric. Remember his navy uniform brushing up against her sundress. Remember the strap slipping off her shoulder. Remember he slept on the morning train into the city. Remember the man next to him with a briefcase wedged between his legs, shifting away. Remember the press of their hanging shirts. Remember how her eyes faded, clouds skittering their surface. Remember her closing the door. They painted cornflower, turning the key. Remember the morning jostle of the subway's thrum and lurch. Remember his mother sagging in her chair, flapping her paper fan. Remember her scent of sweat, shea oil, and chicory. Remember his daughter's pigtails skipping over her Mets t-shirt. Remember as he put on his apron. Remember as she straightened her pencil skirt. Remember the computer screen flashing on. Remember as she answered the phone. Remember the bagels and street coffee. Remember the ping of the elevator. Remember the bunting flying off the plane tree in Central Park, disappearing into the sky. Remember this. 2. Beneath the bruise is a blues, is a blues, is a blues, is a bruise. 3. We don't have room for any more grief. The indigo door closing on its hinges, closing on the blue bowl of grief offered. In this home, grief papers the walls in delft scenes of sheep and rolling hills. Grief is stored in the root cellar. Grief sprouts the old potatoes. Grief gathers in the hairbrush. Grief steams up the mirrors. The bookshelves are lined with grief. Grief nods in the forgotten cornflowers in the pitcher on the kitchen table. Grief makes beds. Grief plays on the stereo. Grief fluffs the sofa pillows. When grief opens a window, grief blues the vacant sky. Grief ticks off the hours on the hallway clock. Grief sets the table every night and does the dishes. On Saturdays, grief washes the floors. When it's cold, grief flames the fireplace. Grief hangs in the spare room closet. Grief presses itself with a hot iron. Jars of pickled grief stack the pantry shelves. Grief reports the nightly news on the TV. Grief knits a scarf. Grief pokes at the embers. Grief locks the door every night before turning in. Rolled up newspapers of grief pile on the front porch. The lawn is overgrown with grief, and the garden abundant with forget-me-nots. And finally, even now, after all these years, each shift in motion begins with one bird's fear, a feather trigger. Maybe it's a wind uptick or the startle of reflection in the Wadden Sea that sets the starling's murmuration. Millions lack in flight, in dance, in Denmark. A form of madness, the starlings chattering in a single voice. Ah, for love of Shakespeare, we speak starling, our mouths black with feathers. I want to dance, but you refuse to lead. Isn't that a form of backstepping, of creating space between us? One could say it is sacred, the wingspan of distance between your body and mine. We could hold a candle or a child within the chapel of light between us. The European starlings arrived in crates as a gift of improvement to the new world, a sonnet of birdsong, released into Central Park. World travels with speed. So when you tell me you still love me, it flies past me. Say it again, louder, so my heart can hear. You know I'm a flight risk. Once we found each other before a congregation, vowing unison. Last night, your body folded around mine, holding my fears in the nest of your hands. We slept like that, as starlings swept the night sky before rising into their black sun. Stunning, you say, meaning the murmuration of birds, meaning me, improbable beauty on an otherwise ordinary day.
I'd like to ask you how you see your Editor's Prize winning work in relation to the genre of poetry. Now, I understand that's an impossible question, but I suppose how I would kind of like train the lens with a little more focus is to say, are there precedents in historical or contemporary poetry for the way that you navigate the making of a poem?
Well, it is an impossible question. So I'll maybe focus on the poems that are in the issue that have been honored that I just read. And from there, maybe think about how they, how I approach my writing in general. But these 5 poems are varied in form. I mean, there's a bit of concrete poem in there. There's long lines. There's some shorter lines. There's all sorts of things going. There's no formal form in these poems, but one thing that many of them have in common is they're ekphrastic, and the Bastille Day in Paris, 2022, Blue Notes, and even after all these years are directly ekphrastic, meaning they're inspired by works of art. And they reflect a practice that I began really in 2021 and have continued. So I'm finding ekphrasis, which is creating art off of art, as incredibly inspiring, and it's driven these poems and many others. In the case of Blue Notes, that idea of, so the original artwork is a square of blue. Every blue is different and unique for everyone that died on 9/11. So it's this massive wall of blue. And it was inspired by the descriptions of that day as having that perfectly blue sky. There wasn't a cloud in it. And people noticed the sky that morning. And so seeing that and that artwork and thinking about what it was like to see that sky and that moment before the planes went into the towers, and imagining the various people who died in that and what they were doing in those moments that morning before, is the first section. And then the second section picks up on that idea of blue and has that blue is a bruise, is blues, it has that sort of the other meaning of blue. And then in the third section, which is actually a concrete poem, meaning it's in the form of, in this case, a house that is so overwhelmed with grief. And so I think also that museum being kind of a house that's overwhelmed with grief came and kind of took hold of me in that poem. And in the poem, even after all these years, that was based on the photographer Soren Solkager's book and film Black Sun, which is on the murmuration. And I'd heard about it on NPR as I was driving, and I rushed home and had to look at the film that NPR had posted, and it was stunning. And it took me into this idea of fear and how quickly fear can enter and where it takes us, because it's like one bird gets a little bit of fear and they just take off in a different direction. It's really quite extraordinary. So I think, sort of my practice of diving into ekphrasis. The other thing that I've been doing over the last several years is working in a form called the Zuihitsu, which is an ancient Japanese form. The poems that I just read that are part of the Missouri Review publication none of them are Zuihitsu, but they're all informed by this practice that I have undertaken. And the way the Zuihitsu works, and there's not too many rules to it, it literally translates into follow the brushstroke. And so you just kind of write what comes to your mind, and then where does it go next? And the brushstroke just is coming across. And for me, the brushstroke is in my mind, and it's something that sets it off, whether it's a piece of art or whether it's like in house hunting, just going and visiting some of my old haunts, places that I lived, or just the kingfisher in Perhaps This Is a Prayer, just one thing that starts that process, and then to follow the brushstroke of my mind, and from my eye to my external eye to the internal eye. And the thing about the Zuihitsu form is that you're constantly taking those leaps, which are true of all sorts of other forms of poetry, but they're, I think, a bit more without any abandon. They just sort of go, and incorporating bits of information and memories and ideas. So, for example, in Bastille Day, that poem emerged because I'd gone to this exhibit at the Pompidou, and it was so horrendous. It was all art from German art from the 1920s. So between the two wars, and there was, it was ugly. It was kind of vile and vulgar and surprising. And I literally had to leave that exhibit, and it suddenly colored my whole experience. I looked at Paris and I thought, oh my gosh, this feels very much, here we are at war again. It's not far from where I was in Paris. And it felt very much like the juxtaposition of war and the frivolity of what was going on in the streets of Paris last summer. It was just off. So I think, I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's sort of the, those are two of the art forms or the genres within the genre of poetry that I've been playing with, that have really informed my work in the last couple of years.
I think that's a wonderful answer, and I think it's introducing me to that concept, that Japanese form that I don't know that I've ever really come across.
No, it's strange, but very few people have, and I found it sometime in 2020, and then I started digging in, and I'm hooked. It's fun.
Yeah, it sounds. I mean, I know that for myself, and Jacob, maybe you have some similar thing that kind of wheels you back into the vortex. But it's usually anaphora for me. Like if there's something that catches my ear, or a sentence that I read, more typically it's something that I hear, though, I think that will just kind of, I'll just need to write it down. And then it's as I'm typing it or as I'm writing it, something else is being generated that's going to be, in this case, it would be the next brush stroke. But if there's ever a point where I sag, or where I need to kind of rev back up, the use of anaphora, the repetition of a short phrase or word will just kind of like hook me right back into, it's like a hinge. And it's just kind of like, okay, here's the next step.
I don't know. It was awesome hearing you talk about how you think of the brushstroke as that movement and the relationship it has to what you refer to as the I in the poem. So the I in your mind that leads you into the poem. And even now, after all these years, you're working towards that final couplet that ends with improbable beauty on an otherwise ordinary day. And to me, that captures so much of what you're describing as these brushstrokes, how they move in these poems and what they bring to the poems. And I don't know, I find so much joy in these poems in those moments of improbable beauty. I think they're marvelous.
Finally, for educators, writing teachers, or writers, this is the part of the conversation where we can give educators and writers just it's endlessly fascinating how many prompts there are and that are yet to be. And so what I'd like to ask you is, what's a prompt that you might give to educators, writing teachers, or writers, either based on one of the poems or any of the poems featured in this issue, or one that has worked to engage you and really helped you find your way to the creation of a living poem? Yeah. And as well, do you have a short list of kind of recommended poets or poems or related or non-related texts that have helped you over the years cultivate your sense of what you're trying to do when you write poems?
Yeah. Okay. Hold on to your seats. Well, what I'm going to do is suggest an ekphrastic, ekphrastic poetry as a prompt, and I'll sort of lead into it a little bit. But you know, ekphrastic poetry is also ancient, like the Zui Hitsu, maybe even older. I don't know. Very ancient. And for those of you who don't know, I know you do, but it's Greek for description, which is kind of broad. And yet the challenge in writing is not to replicate the artwork, not to describe it, even though that is the definition, or to even translate it into poetry. It's really about using art as a launching pad for something completely new. How do you expand on it? How do you go beyond that? And so when I think of the poems that are directly off of art, whether it's the video of the murmuration starlings, or the what I describe as the vulgar exhibit of German art, or Spence Finch's wonderful, amazing exhibit at the 9/11 Museum. All of those are just the beginning of something. And so, and even the house hunting, or where you're looking at a scene, and then that scene then becomes so I'm going to suggest that in taking an ekphrastic look at things, that you begin to use that as a launching pad for other things, whether it's something you encounter or it's a piece of work. But for my prompt, one of the things that I did as soon as the museum started opening up again, and I'm not a crazy museum goer, but for some reason, with the pandemic, when things closed down and when things started to open, that's where I wanted to go. I felt this absolute compulsion to go. And so wherever I was, and I was touring a book at that time, sort of, mostly on Zoom, but when I could, and I would go to a museum and I'd take photos. Something that caught me, I just started taking photos. And then I would get home and I'd look at those, and one of them would catch me, and I'd find that it would lead to a thought. It would lead to an idea. I would see something coming out of that. It would emerge. So the prompt is to go to an art gallery or a museum or a sculpture exhibit and take some photos on your phone. Find the things that just sort of move you. You don't know why. Then, when you have time, shuffle through those. Find something that just, for some reason, it catches your attention. You have to look at it again. Put your phone down and start writing, and write everything that comes to mind. And then if you get stuck, I suggest researching the artist or the era in which that artwork was created, or the place that it was done, or something, because generally there'll be something else that will take you in another direction. And so to get to those kind of dramatic leaps is what happens. So the prompt is go out, find some art, go crazy, write like crazy, and then just keep at it and find some fun twists and turns in it.
Excellent. Thank you. Do you have a list of kind of authors that you return to and
Yeah.
works?
Yeah. Well, yes. So, I mean, it seems like every poet from forever has written ekphrastic poems. And I found those to be really interesting and varied. And so that's kind of fun. But I'll try to keep it tight. So Federico Garcia Lorca is one of my touchstones, and I return again and again to Garcia Lorca's work for those moments of duende, that sort of dark magic that's in his work. I think my writing has both the beauty and then that dark side of it. And I don't know why it does that, but I tend to see both sides of things, that maybe one's that external eye, and then the internal eye tends to go into a darker place. And I find Garcia Lorca's work to be really compelling. I mean, it's so gorgeous, and yet there's a brutality that is in all those lines. God, I love, Kazim Ali, and I love Lucille Clifton and Ellen Bryant Voigt. The new collected version or volume of Ellen Bryant Voigt is amazing. I read it in one sitting. Kimiko Han has been very helpful with the Zuihitsu. I think at some point she was the only one. And she wrote a whole volume of Zuihitsu that came out in like 1996. So sort of studying her work and a few others. Kazim Ali has written a couple. Larry Levis for leaps and long poems. Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry was sort of got me through last summer. Sort of that the combination of, well, first of all, he's written a lot about war, and he has a whole series called The Window Poems that were written in 1968. And what he was seeing out the window, but he's thinking, and I used a line from one of them in the Bastille poem, but he's looking out his window and he's writing every day, and he's thinking about the war, the Vietnam War. He's taking in nature, and he's wrestling with his faith. And so, yeah, Wendell Berry. Terrence Hayes. Terrence Hayes for me is so fun, because I think that guy loves puzzles, and I love puzzles, and form is a puzzle. And so I write a lot in form, and then I kind of unravel it. But I tend to, when I'm struggling with a poem, I will put it in form, and then I'll take it out of form. Right now, I am writing a series of abecedarians that are all right, left, justified. It is the most difficult thing. It's like you can't, you have to get every single word right. It's almost impossible, but it's a game. And so Terrence Hayes is, I mean, wonderful writer, but also like just a great great form poet. Frank O'Hara, obviously an ekphrastic poet, but also that observational, is walking around the streets and pulling all that in and turning them into poems, sense of humor. And no, I just finished the beautiful book by Dean Radar. And it's a beautiful ekphrastic book. It's like this big, and it's called Before the Borderless Dialogues with the Art of Saitwambi. And Dean was dealing with grief, and he was struggling with writing about grief. And then he encountered an exhibit of Saitwambi and started writing in conversation with those paintings. And the process is this gorgeous book that has a painting on one page and then across from it a poem. So it's really, really remarkable if you're looking for great ekphrastic work, and where you can see the painting there too. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I could just go on. Sorry, I just really could go on.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Jacob Hall, our poetry editor. Thank you to the Missouri Humanities Council. And most of all, thank you to Heidi Seaborn, who won the 2022 Jeffrey E. Smith Editor's Prize in Poetry, for her wonderful poetry, for her time here today, and for all the great suggestions and all the great insights that she was able to give us. Thank you again, and goodbye.